The Galactic Empire was a colossus, a sprawling dominion of star systems united under the banner of conquest and order. Its fleets were vast, its technology unparalleled, and its warriors legendary. For centuries, the empire had expanded its reach, subjugating civilizations that dared resist and absorbing those that bowed. Their philosophy was simple. Strength was the ultimate currency, and power was the only language worth speaking. When they turned their gaze toward humanity, it was not with curiosity but with disdain. Earth, a fledgling player on the galactic stage, was seen as little more than an insect scurrying beneath the Empire's boot. Yet, the Empire was not without a sense of ceremony. They issued a challenge, a duel of champions, to determine humanity's fate. It was a tradition, a way to assert dominance without the mess of full-scale war. The Empire would send their greatest warriors, and humanity, they assumed, would send their best soldiers. The outcome, they believed, was inevitable. The Empire's champions were a sight to behold. First among them was Kralthax, a towering brute whose muscles seemed to ripple like molten iron beneath his skin. He was a product of genetic engineering, a being designed for war, with reflexes faster than a plasma bolt and strength enough to crush starship hulls with his bare hands. Then there was Zanara, a cybernetic marvel whose body was a fusion of organic tissue and advanced machinery. Her eyes glowed with a cold, calculating light, and her arsenal of built-in weapons made her a walking fortress. Finally, there was Commander Velos, the Empire's master strategist. His mind was a labyrinth of tactics and contingencies, and his presence on the battlefield was said to turn the tide of wars before a single shot was fired. Together, they represented the pinnacle of the Empire's might, and they arrived at the neutral planet of HFY Loth with an air of invincibility. Humanity, meanwhile, was in chaos. The United Earth Council convened in a frenzy, their debates echoing through the halls of the orbital station. Diplomats argued for negotiation, generals called for a military response, and scientists proposed technological solutions. But the Empire's terms were clear. This was a test of strength, not diplomacy. Humanity had to send a champion, and that champion would face the Empire's warriors in a series of challenges. The stakes were nothing less than Earth's survival. As the Council descended into gridlock, a single voice cut through the noise. It was not the voice of a soldier or a politician but of a mechanic, a woman named Sarah Thompson, known to her colleagues as Wrench. Sarah was not what anyone expected. She was not tall or imposing, nor did she carry herself with the swagger of a warrior. She was of average height, with calloused hands and a grease-streaked face that spoke of long hours spent tinkering with machines. Her tool of choice was a wrench, a simple, unassuming instrument that she wielded with the precision of a surgeon. Sarah had spent her life fixing things, starships, hovercrafts, even the occasional AI, and she had a reputation for solving problems that others deemed impossible. When she stepped into the council chamber, her presence was met with skepticism. "You?" one of the generals scoffed. "You think you can stand against the Empire's finest?" Sarah's response was calm but firm. "I don't need to be stronger than them. I just need to be smarter." Her confidence was not unfounded. Sarah's mind was her greatest weapon, a labyrinth of ingenuity and resourcefulness. She had spent years working in the underbelly of space stations, repairing ships that had no business flying and jury-rigging solutions out of scrap metal. She understood machines in a way few others did, and she knew that the Empire's reliance on technology and brute strength was also their weakness. After a heated debate, the Council reluctantly agreed to let Sarah represent humanity. It was a gamble, but one they had little choice but to take. As Sarah prepared for the journey to HFY Loth, she reflected on her life. She had never sought glory or recognition. Her work had always been about the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. But now, the fate of her species rested on her shoulders. She packed her tools carefully, her wrench resting at the top of the bag. It was more than a tool to her. It was a symbol of her craft, her resilience, and her refusal to back down from a challenge. The journey to HFY Loth was uneventful, but as her ship approached the planet, Sarah felt a knot of tension in her chest. She was not afraid, but she was acutely aware of the stakes. The Empire's warriors were waiting, and they would not take her lightly. When Sarah stepped onto the surface of HFY Loth, she was met with a scene of stark contrast. The Empire's champions stood in a line, their imposing figures silhouetted against the alien sky. Behind them loomed a massive holographic display, broadcasting the event to the galaxy. Kralthax sneered as he saw her, his voice booming like thunder. "This is your champion? A mechanic with a wrench?" The other warriors laughed, their voices dripping with contempt. Sarah ignored them, her eyes scanning the battlefield. It was a barren wasteland, dotted with wreckage from ancient wars, a fitting arena for a duel of survival. The Empire's leader, a figure clad in shimmering armor, stepped forward to address Sarah. "You have one chance to prove humanity's worth," he said, his voice cold and imperious. "Face our champions, and if you survive, your species will be spared. Fail, and Earth will be assimilated into the Empire." Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on her wrench. She knew the odds were against her, but she also knew that the Empire had underestimated her. They saw her as weak, as insignificant, but they had no idea what she was capable of. The first challenge began with Kralthax stepping forward, his massive fists clenched. "Strength," he growled, "is the measure of a warrior. Let us see if you can withstand even a fraction of mine." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She knew she could not match his physical power, but she also knew that strength was not always about muscles. As Kralthax charged, Sarah moved with a speed that surprised even herself. She dodged his blows, her movements precise and calculated. When he swung at her, she ducked beneath his arm and brought her wrench down on a weak point in his armor. The blow was not enough to defeat him, but it was enough to make him stagger. The crowd, both on HFY Loth and watching from afar, fell silent. The Empire's greatest warrior had been struck by a mechanic with a wrench. As the first challenge unfolded, Sarah's mind raced. She knew this was only the beginning, and the Empire's other champions would not be so easily outmaneuvered. But for now, she had proven one thing: humanity was not to be underestimated. The duel was far from over, and Sarah was ready to fight for her species. One wrench swing at a time. The galaxy watched, and for the first time in centuries, the Empire felt a flicker of doubt. The silence that followed Sarah's first strike against Kralthax was deafening. The Empire's warriors, so confident in their superiority, now watched with narrowed eyes as the human mechanic stood her ground. Kralthax roared, his pride wounded more than his body, and charged again. This time Sarah didn't dodge. Instead, she planted her feet firmly, her wrench held like a baton, and waited. At the last moment, she sidestepped and swung the wrench with all her might, striking the joint of his knee. The crack of metal against armor echoed across the battlefield, and Kralthax stumbled, his massive frame crashing to the ground. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She leapt onto his back, her wrench finding the seams of his armor, and with a series of precise strikes, disabled the power core that fueled his enhancements. Kralthax let out a final, guttural growl before collapsing, motionless. The crowd erupted in murmurs, their disbelief palpable. Sarah stepped back, breathing heavily but standing tall. The first challenge was hers. The Empire's second champion, Zanara, stepped forward, her mechanical limbs whirring softly as she moved. Her glowing eyes fixed on Sarah, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her expression, only cold calculation. "You are resourceful," Zanara said, her voice a blend of human and synthetic tones. "But resourcefulness will not save you from me." Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and tightened her grip on her wrench. She knew Zanara was different from Kralthax. Where the brute relied on raw power, Zanara was a fusion of technology and precision. She was a problem that couldn't be solved with brute force alone. The second challenge began with a blur of motion. Zanara's arm transformed into a plasma blade, and she lunged at Sarah with terrifying speed. Sarah barely had time to raise her wrench, deflecting the blade with a shower of sparks. The impact sent a jolt through her arms, but she held firm. Zanara pressed the attack, her movements a deadly dance of steel and light. Sarah retreated, her mind racing. She needed to find a weakness, a flaw in Zanara's design. As the cybernetic warrior advanced, Sarah noticed something. A faint hum emanating from Zanara's chest. It was her power source, a compact reactor that fueled her enhancements. If Sarah could disrupt it, she might stand a chance. Dodging another strike, Sarah rolled to the side and grabbed a piece of debris from the ground. A jagged shard of metal. She hurled it at Zanara, not to harm her but to distract her. The shard clanged against Zanara's shoulder, and for a split second, her attention wavered. That was all Sarah needed. She darted forward, her wrench swinging in a wide arc. Zanara raised her arm to block, but Sarah's target wasn't her body. It was the ground beneath her. The wrench struck a loose panel, triggering a hidden mechanism. The floor beneath Zanara's feet gave way, and she stumbled, her balance faltering. Sarah seized the opportunity, driving the wrench into the reactor on Zanara's chest. The hum grew louder, then sputtered, and Zanara's glowing eyes flickered before dimming entirely. She collapsed, her systems shutting down. Sarah stepped back, her chest heaving, but there was no time to rest. The Empire's final champion was already stepping forward. Commander Velos was unlike the others. He carried no visible weapons, and his armor was sleek and unadorned. His presence was calm, almost serene, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You have proven yourself resourceful," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "But resourcefulness alone cannot overcome strategy. Let us see how you fare against the mind." The third challenge was not a physical battle but a test of wits. A holographic display materialized between them, projecting a complex simulation of a space battle. The objective was simple: outmaneuver the opponent and destroy their fleet. Velos's reputation as a master strategist was well-earned, and Sarah knew she was outmatched in terms of experience. But she also knew that the Empire's strategies were rigid, predictable. They relied on overwhelming force and flawless execution, leaving little room for creativity. Sarah, on the other hand, had spent her life improvising, finding solutions where none seemed possible. The simulation began, and Velos moved with precision, his fleet advancing in perfect formation. Sarah's forces were scattered, disorganized, but she had a plan. She feigned retreat, luring Velos's fleet into a trap. When his ships pursued, she activated a hidden minefield, crippling his advance. Velos adjusted his strategy, his fleet regrouping with practiced efficiency. Sarah countered by sacrificing a portion of her fleet to create a diversion, drawing his forces away from their objective. The battle raged on, a clash of minds as much as tactics. Velos's moves were calculated, each one a step in a carefully orchestrated plan. Sarah's were unpredictable, chaotic, but effective. She exploited every weakness, every gap in his defenses, forcing him to adapt. As the simulation reached its climax, Sarah made her final move. She redirected her remaining ships into a suicidal charge, overwhelming Velos's flagship with sheer numbers. The holographic display flickered, then displayed the words, "Victory! Human fleet." Velos stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "You have bested me," he said, his voice tinged with respect. "But the final challenge remains. The Empire's leader will not be so easily defeated." Sarah nodded, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. She had come this far, and she would see it through to the end. The Empire's leader stepped forward, his armor gleaming in the alien light. He was a towering figure, his presence commanding and his eyes filled with a cold, calculating intelligence. "You have proven yourself worthy of this final challenge," he said, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "But know this, I am not like the others. I am the Empire's will made manifest. You cannot defeat me." Sarah met his gaze, her wrench resting on her shoulder. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice steady. The final challenge was about to begin, and the galaxy held its breath. Sarah knew this would be the hardest fight of her life, but she also knew she had something the Empire's leader did not, ingenuity, resilience, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest wrench could bring down the mightiest empire. The empire's leader, known only as Imperator Dracon, stepped forward with a presence that seemed to warp the air around him. His armor, a masterpiece of blackened alloy and glowing crimson veins, radiated an aura of invincibility. His eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto Sarah with a gaze that felt like it could strip her soul bare. "You have come far, human," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her chest. "But this is where your journey ends. No amount of ingenuity can overcome the might of the Empire." Sarah tightened her grip on her wrench, her knuckles white against the worn metal. She was exhausted, her body aching from the previous challenges, but her resolve was unshakable. She had faced impossible odds before, and she had always found a way to win. This was no different. "You talk a lot for someone who's about to lose," she shot back, her voice steady despite the fatigue weighing her down. The crowd, both on XY Loth and watching from across the galaxy, fell silent. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The final showdown between the Empire's ultimate champion and the scrappy human mechanic who had defied all expectations. Dracon moved first, his speed belying his massive frame. He closed the distance between them in an instant, his armored fist swinging toward Sarah with the force of a freight train. She barely managed to duck, the air whistling as his fist passed inches above her head. She retaliated with a swing of her wrench, aiming for the joints of his armor, but he caught the tool mid-swing, his grip crushing the metal as if it were paper. Sarah let go, stumbling back as he tossed the mangled wrench aside. "Is this all you have?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "A broken tool and a broken spirit?" Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she scanned the battlefield, her mind racing. Dracon was faster, stronger, and better equipped than any opponent she had faced before. But he was also overconfident, and that was a weakness she could exploit. She darted to the side, grabbing a piece of debris. A jagged shard of metal from one of the wrecked ships scattered across the arena. Dracon followed, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he were toying with her. He swung again, and this time Sarah used the shard to deflect the blow, the impact sending a shockwave through her arms. She gritted her teeth and pressed forward, driving the shard into a gap in his armor. It was a shallow wound, but it was enough to make him pause. "You'll have to do better than that," Dracon growled, ripping the shard from his side and tossing it aside. He lunged again, his movements faster now, more aggressive. Sarah barely kept up, her body pushed to its limits as she dodged and weaved, searching for an opening. She knew she couldn't win a straight fight. She needed to outthink him. As she retreated, her foot caught on a loose cable, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. Dracon loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "This is the end," he said, raising his fist for the final blow. But Sarah wasn't done yet. As Dracon's fist came down, she rolled to the side, the ground shaking as his punch cratered the earth. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes locking onto something in the distance. A fallen piece of machinery, its power core still faintly glowing. It was a long shot, but it was her only chance. She sprinted toward it, Dracon hot on her heels. He was faster, but she was smaller and more agile, weaving through the wreckage with practiced ease. When she reached the machine, she dropped to her knees, her hands flying over the controls. Dracon was right behind her, his hand closing around her shoulder. "Enough of this?" he snarled, lifting her off the ground. Sarah didn't fight back. Instead, she reached into the machine, her fingers closing around the power core. It was hot, searing her skin, but she held on, pulling it free just as Dracon turned her to face him. "You're finished," he said, his voice cold and final. Sarah smiled, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "No," she said, "you are." With a surge of strength, she slammed the power core into the exposed wiring on his chest. The core overloaded, its energy surging into Dracon's systems. He roared, his body convulsing as the energy coursed through him. Sarah dropped to the ground, rolling away as the core exploded in a blinding flash of light. When the dust settled, Dracon was on his knees, his armor cracked and smoldering. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. Sarah stood, her body battered but unbroken. "You underestimated me," she said, her voice steady. "You thought strength was all that mattered. But strength without ingenuity is just brute force. And brute force can always be outsmarted." Dracon's eyes dimmed, and he collapsed, his massive frame hitting the ground with a thunderous crash. The arena was silent, the crowd too stunned to react. Then, slowly, the silence was broken by a single cheer, followed by another, until the entire planet erupted in applause. Sarah stood amidst the wreckage, her chest heaving, her body screaming in protest. She had done it. She had defeated the Empire's greatest champions and proven that humanity was not to be underestimated. As the cheers echoed around her, she felt a sense of pride she had never known before. But there was no time to rest. The Empire's leader might be defeated, but the Empire itself still loomed, its fleets and armies waiting for their next move. Sarah knew this was only the beginning. She bent down, picking up her battered wrench from the ground. It was dented and scorched, but it was still intact, just like her. She tightened her grip and turned to face the horizon, where the stars glittered like diamonds. The galaxy was watching, and Sarah was ready for whatever came next.